Welcome back to our study of Colossians. I want to pick right back up where we left off because in the last session we talked about Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 20, where Paul really tells us, honestly, about as much about Jesus as any passage you could look at. Now, that's a little bit of an overstatement. You've got passages like Hebrews 1, 1 through 4, John 1, 1 through 18, Philippians 2, 1 through 11, some passages like that that really just draw together key truths about Jesus. And Colossians 1, 15 through 20 is on the list. And we notice that there's a real structure to what Paul is doing. He's saying that Christ is enough for you, and you can know this because he alone is supreme in creating all things, in holding all things together, and in actually providing salvation for all things, reconciliation for all things. So if people were to apply for the job of leading your life, no other application has what Jesus has. That's kind of the point. And now I want to kind of we're going to look at a fairly small section of Scripture, Colossians chapter 1, verses 21 through 23. And it's just a little bit of a, not quite a tag on, but a little bit of a final statement that I think Paul, almost like an appendix to this great poem that he's provided for us. And I'm looking forward to walking through this together with you. Let me read the text to you, and then we'll say a few things about it. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your own minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. Now, that's a small section of Scripture, and where it is dense and jam-packed, it's not quite as loaded as some of the other larger sections that we're going to try to tackle in the same basic amount of space and time. So why give this one a lot of direct attention? I'd say two reasons. One, because what's in there really, really matters. And we're going to talk it through on its own terms and just pay attention to what Paul felt the need to reinforce. That's probably the proper way to see this little addendum here. And the second reason I actually want to spend a little bit more time on this text is because it raises two really interesting and important theological issues for us. Now, they're very different from one another, but they're both very important for us to think through. So normally my goal in these is really just to talk through the text and to let it speak for itself. And any number of theological traditions, I think, would agree with 95% of what's said because I'm just trying to listen to the text and present its basic truths. Today, we're going to talk about a couple of things that different folks disagree on in certain respects. And so you can do with that as is appropriate as you're trying to study along Colossians together or potentially in a group. So first of all, let's just kind of walk through this text and notice what does it say on its own terms. And I mentioned that I think this is a reinforcement or kind of a doubling down and digging into the claims that Paul has just made. We really focused our attention last time on the creation piece, but don't miss the second half of the poem. It very much is like in the same way that he's supreme in creation, he's supreme in reconciliation as well. And through Jesus, all things are reconciled to God, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Then he kind of leans into this. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. Now, I want you to notice again, remember if you maybe think back to the first session, my picture of the gospel, which hopefully is as helpful to you as it is to me, is an understanding that the gospel actually approaches us on many different levels. And so you have God, who is, of course, at the top, and he has created us to engage in this life-giving relationship where we receive life from him and we worship. And this is not an individual thing, but we do this with others who are also a part of the created order. We were created for a community, and we together oversee creation. We cultivate its fruitfulness, and then therefore we experience peace with ourselves. This is shalom. This is how life is supposed to be. But sin comes in and ruins all of that. It breaks down this relationship. And then as a result of breaking down this, it breaks down the whole thing. So again, harmony is replaced with blame, peace is replaced with shame, and hard work is replaced with toilsome labor, and the ground fights back against us. And this is what the Bible tells us about the nature of the world we live in. And I think what Paul is saying here is, like all things are reconciled. That's the big picture that he covered in verses 18, 19, and 20. And now he wants to double down and make sure that you understand that this relationship right here is the centerpiece of this. So the issue was you were alienated from God. This broke down. And then you became enemies in your minds through your evil behavior. So your thinking has a part to do with this and your doing has a part to do with this. But now, those are two of Paul's very favorite words. But now, he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body. This is how it happens. Christ became a human and died and in a body on our behalf, and he died to present us holy in God's sight, without blemish and free from accusation, so that we could be the kind of people who, at the end of the day, you can throw arrows at us, but they're not going to stick, because Jesus has actually died for us. And then he goes on, if you continue in your faith. And that right there is maybe the biggest word in this passage, if. That's where I want to camp out with you. If you continue in your faith. So I think what Paul is saying is, listen, all of this can be yours. All of this can be true of and for you if you continue in your faith. Continuing on, he says, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. In terms of our overall structure of how we're walking through Colossians, we're still looking at why we should stay with Jesus and trust in his sufficiency. We've seen so far that we should stay with him because of what God has already done and is doing in us. That was chapter 1, verses 1 through 14. We should stay with him because Christ is supreme. That was 1:15 through 20. And now we should stay with Jesus because of the necessity of faith. We must believe if we're going to continue to receive the benefits of the gift that's been made available to us. That essentially is what's being said here. So now what I want to do is I want to address two fairly common, maybe in certain ways, maybe the first one, increasingly common theological questions that arise when studying Colossians. The first one I want to talk about is the issue of universalism. And then the second one I want to talk about is Calvinism. Now, let me say very quickly, because I know some of you will affirm Calvinism, and I certainly am a big fan of John Calvin. He's absolutely one of my favorite theologians and commentators to read. These are two very different issues. Let me say that very clearly. I do not regard these as at all the same. I regard one of them as sort of a very friendly, brotherly dispute. This would be Calvinism. I myself am not a Calvinist, although I probably have some Calvinist leanings that I want to sound like a Calvinist sometimes because the Bible sounds like it sometimes. I regard universalism as a real danger, actually, and as a real threat. And I want to talk about it first along these lines. And it's growing in popularity, the idea that all people in the end will be saved. And there are different versions of this. Some opt for a pluralistic universalism, which is that there are multiple paths up the mountain, and who are you to say otherwise? There are many, though, who would argue for what they would call a Christian universalism, that all will eventually be saved through Jesus. And so it's not a matter of whether we're saved through Jesus. The answer to that one is yes, but in the end, all people will be saved through Jesus. And I'll be honest with you, I think there are a lot of motivations for why people might believe this. I myself have at times wanted this to be the case. And you could probably understand why. Like, nobody likes saying, hey, hell is a real thing and some people are going there. Judgment is a real thing and some people will actually be separated from God's presence forever. And that's especially hard to say in our world because we recognize as Christians that we're increasingly thought of as judgmental and mean. And when we say, yeah, we believe in a judgment day, that there's eternal consequences and that some will be with God in a renewed creation and others will not forever, like that's sounds mean and it doesn't make sense to most folks in our world. And there's a real sense in which it's hard for us to be accused of things like judgmental and mean and backward and bigoted. And you just believe this dusty old book from 2,000 years ago and get with the times and get on the right side of history and so on and so forth. And so I think some of that honestly is the motivation, but I want to be very fair and acknowledge that those who opt for this teaching don't always opt for it because they're afraid to stand up for the truth. They opt for it because they think that this is what the text demands. They believe that reading the text properly lands us in a place like this. And I want to explain that I don't think that's the case. There are a couple of things in this passage in Colossians 1 that are taken in that direction. One, and it's mainly from the poem from 1:15 to 20. One is the language of all. So I want you to notice that, verse 19 says, for God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. We mean all. We mean that there's no part of God that wasn't dwelling in Jesus. And this isn't a talk on the Trinity, but the idea is there's not like a little bit of God in Jesus and a little bit of God over there. It's not how it works. It's all here. Then we continue, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. And so now we have salvation language, reconciliation language applying to all things. And some people will say all means all. And so if you're going to believe that all the fullness of God dwelt in Jesus, and to pull in some passages from Romans, if you're going to believe that all people sin in and like Adam, then you need to believe that all people can be justified and receive freedom from condemnation through Christ. All means all. And I think that's a misunderstanding of what Paul is saying. There's been a distinction. I don't know who first made this distinction, but some would say that sometimes all means all without exception, like every single one, and other times all means all without distinction, as in all meaning Jews and Gentiles, males and females, all these various things. And so sometimes the answer to the universalist interpretation of all is just to recognize that we have to take every instance of the term on its own terms, and we have to pay attention to how it fits with what else is being said in the context. The other thing in this passage that is used with respect to universalism is the idea of reconciliation. So again, that's the language, that all things are reconciled. This actually, in this particular case, is where I think the error goes. I kind of think that all in Colossians 1, even all things being reconciled, does actually mean all without exception, everything. But reconciliation by making peace does not necessarily mean a positive coming to peace. If you think about this in the context of war, which this term very much was often used in the context of war, then to be reconciled doesn't mean that like, hey, it's all good, we're good now. No, to be reconciled to this other leader may very well mean that you were defeated by them and that therefore peace was established against your will. Honestly, that's what I think this is saying. And I think this because of, a number of theological reasons, but I think it's the most natural way to read the text. Given that in this very next section, Paul says, all this can be yours if you continue in faith. And that's where I come back to this term. Paul does not at all seem to think that by saying that all things are reconciled to God through the cross, that this is going to be present and available for everyone. No. It's available for everyone, but it's not going to be accessed by everyone. It's going to be accessed by those who have faith and who continue in faith. That seems to me to be the clear way to understand this text. The second issue is the issue of Calvinism. And again, it's very different, very, very different. I regard them as in two very distinct categories. I hope I've made that clear. But I do want to, just for the sake of conversation, articulate the two ways of reading it. I've told you how I read it. I think that when Paul says, if you continue in faith, there's a very real and genuine and kind of just how you would assume it to mean to that word if. Meaning like, if you do, you will experience the blessing, but if you don't, you won't. A statement that tends to assume that there's a possibility that you won't. So that's what I think it's saying. It's not that I don't think that God is able to keep us close. He makes it very clear that he will never cast us away or allow anybody else to snatch us out of his hand. But I think that there's still some measure of freedom in these things that we exercise by continuing to trust. A Calvinist wouldn't necessarily disagree with all of what I just said, but they would suggest that the if here is sort of a hypothetical warning. And some of my favorite, again, commentaries on Colossians are by Calvinist guys like Doug Moo and others of that stripe. And he explains this as a hypothetical if, that in reality, it's not possible for those who are saved, who are legitimately like part of God's family, to not persevere. One of the tenets of most Calvinist beliefs is the idea that those who have been elected by God and they've been captured by his effectual call, and his grace has made its way to them because he gave them faith as a gift to receive it, will in fact persevere to the end no matter what. And that idea sits in some tension with this. But again, the explanation of this is that when Paul says if, it's hypothetical, and it's actually the warning that itself will cause them to maintain their faith by God's providential guidance. It's not as, if you're not a Calvinist, maybe you think that sounds like cheating or like a crazy idea. No, I really want to defend it at some level because it's not a crazy idea. It's kind of like what we might do with our kids, if we're, and I don't know that this is good parenting, but sometimes we do it. You're traveling across the country and the kids are being bad and you say to them, hey, if you guys don't knock it off, you're going to get out and walk. It's like 200 miles from where we're going, And what we don't mean is that that's actually going to happen, but we're communicating that to make the point that there will be some consequence and it won't be fun for you. And threatening them in that way is designed to get them to continue on. So it's not exactly a parallel, but maybe that will help. I find that, honestly, as much as I respect it and those who say it, I find it not to be a very adequate explanation of this passage. I think that if we allow this passage to speak on its own terms, it's indeed calling for us to exercise a faith that is not necessarily guaranteed, even if we're in Christ. So this has gotten a little bit heady, and I'm okay with that sometimes. Let's remind ourselves of some things. Let's remind ourselves that what Paul wants to do here is to drive home and dig in and reinforce what he has just said about Jesus, that Jesus alone is the one who provides salvation, reconciliation, starting with overcoming the alienation, our relationship with God, and then extending out to the rest, ultimately, of all creation. That is really what Paul wants to drive home, and he wants to suggest that this is available to you if you continue to trust in the sufficiency of Christ. If you don't start messing with faith by allowing something else to come in alongside Jesus or in competition with Jesus. If you do that, then you are no longer submitted to the lordship of Christ. And so Paul's very clear here that that's what's going on. And maybe it would be good to end with this. Not so much the universalists, but where I would agree with the Calvinists and where the Calvinists would agree with me, is that what Paul is saying in this passage is that Christ has made everything available for you in terms of the salvation that's offered. And that what we are called to is to continue in faith, to continue trusting, to continue believing, to continue taking Christ at his word, which means acknowledging and accepting the gift that's been offered on our behalf and actually entrusting him with our lives. So as we continue to lay out Paul's reasons for staying with Jesus, so far we've seen that we should stay with Jesus out of a memory, out of remembering all that God has done and is doing and will do in us, out of the supremacy of Christ. And then here in this case, we stay with Jesus because ongoing faith is necessary to receive the benefits that he offers.